The end of World War II in May 1945 left Germany with millions of pieces of military equipment scattered across a devastated landscape. Equipment that represented both the recent Nazi regime and the practical problem of what to do with the physical remnants of a military machine that had been comprehensively defeated. Among the most symbolically loaded of these items were the distinctive steel helmets, the Stahlhelm, that had become one of the most recognizable symbols of German military forces throughout both world wars. The helmet's design, with its characteristic coal scuttle shape and extended neck protection, had become so associated with German militarism that its very silhouette carried ideological weight beyond its function as protective equipment. In the immediate aftermath of surrender, vast stockpiles of these helmets existed in depots, armories, abandoned military facilities, and battlefields across Germany and occupied Europe, creating both a practical disposal problem and a symbolic question about how to handle objects so closely identified with the Nazi state. The Allied occupation authorities who assumed control of Germany in 1945 faced numerous decisions about captured German military equipment, decisions that reflected both practical considerations and broader questions about denazification and Germany's political future. The general policy was that weapons would be destroyed or repurposed, that equipment with potential civilian use might be distributed to German authorities for reconstruction efforts, and that items with no practical value would be disposed of in ways that prevented their use as rallying symbols for any resurgent nationalist movement. The Nazi helmets fell into a complicated category. They were clearly military equipment that should not be available for paramilitary use, yet they were also potentially useful protective gear that might serve civilian purposes if properly handled. And they were physical objects whose destruction or preservation carried symbolic implications that went beyond their material function. The initial Allied approach to captured German helmets varied by occupation zone and by the specific military units responsible for different areas. American forces, operating under directives that emphasized thoroughgoing destruction of German military capability, initially treated helmets as military equipment to be collected and destroyed. Vast quantities were gathered from surrendered Wehrmacht units, from abandoned depots, and from battlefields where they lay among other debris of defeat. Some were shipped to Allied countries as war souvenirs or as scrap metal to be melted down for civilian use. Others were simply dumped in landfills or buried in mass disposal sites, alongside other military equipment deemed too dangerous or too symbolically problematic to leave accessible. American military government officials took particular care to remove Nazi insignia and symbols from any helmets that might be retained for civilian use, grinding off or painting over the eagles and swastikas that had decorated wartime production. The British occupation authorities approached the helmet question somewhat differently, influenced by their own military traditions and by practical considerations about reconstruction needs. British forces recognized that steel helmets, stripped of their Nazi markings, could serve useful purposes in civilian contexts, construction work, mining, firefighting, and other occupations where head protection was valuable. British military government units organized programs to collect helmets, remove Nazi insignia, and distribute them to German civilian authorities for use in reconstruction efforts. This approach reflected both pragmatic recognition that destroyed Germany needed every available resource and a calculation that allowing civilians to use denazified helmets was less dangerous than creating scarcity that might drive Germans to preserve Wehrmacht equipment secretly. British authorities believed that visible civilian repurposing of military equipment actually aided denazification by demonstrating the Nazi military's complete defeat and subordination to civilian needs. The Soviet occupation zone saw perhaps the most thorough destruction of captured German military equipment, including helmets, driven by both ideological conviction that all traces of Nazi militarism should be eliminated and by Soviet needs for scrap metal to support their own reconstruction. Soviet forces systematically collected German helmets and other steel equipment, shipped much of it to the Soviet Union for melting down and reprocessing, and destroyed or buried what couldn't be economically transported. Soviet authorities were particularly concerned about any Wehrmacht equipment remaining accessible to German civilians, fearing it could supply underground resistance movements or could serve as symbols around which nationalist sentiment might coalesce. The thoroughness of Soviet collection efforts meant that relatively few helmets remained in civilian circulation in the Eastern Zone, compared to Western zones where Allied policies were less systematic. The French occupation zone, smaller than the other three but still substantial, followed approaches similar to British policies, allowing controlled civilian repurposing of denazified helmets while ensuring that no stockpiles remained that could equip paramilitary organizations. French military government officials, drawing on their experience with post-WWI disarmament and their awareness of how inadequate that disarmament had proven, were careful to prevent any accumulation of military equipment that might enable German remilitarization. Yet they also recognized practical value in allowing helmets to serve civilian purposes, particularly in reconstruction work where French economic interests were served by rapid rebuilding of German productive capacity. The German authorities, who gradually assumed greater administrative responsibility as occupation evolved, had their own complicated relationship with Nazi-era military equipment. For many Germans involved in reconstruction and in building new democratic institutions, Nazi helmets and other Wehrmacht equipment represented a past they wanted to distance themselves from, symbols of a regime that had brought catastrophic defeat and moral shame. These Germans supported thorough destruction or civilian repurposing that would erase military associations. Other Germans, particularly those who had served in the Wehrmacht and who distinguished between military service and Nazi ideology, felt that complete destruction of equipment showed disrespect for soldiers who had fought honorably regardless of the regime they served. These conflicting attitudes influenced how German civilian authorities handled helmet distribution when they gained control of such decisions. On the practical uses to which denazified German helmets were put revealed creative adaptation to Germany's desperate post-war circumstances. Construction workers rebuilding bombed cities used them as protection against falling debris. Coal miners in the Ruhr region, where mining was critical to economic recovery, wore them in pits where proper mining helmets were scarce. Fire brigades, police forces, and civil defense organizations that were being rebuilt under Allied supervision sometimes used repurposed helmets when purpose-made equipment wasn't available. In each case, removal of Nazi insignia was supposed to be thorough, though enforcement varied, and some helmets retained traces of their military origin that authorities either missed or chose to ignore given urgent practical needs. And the symbolic dimensions of what happened to Nazi helmets extended beyond occupation policies to influence how post-war Germany confronted its recent past. The sight of Wehrmacht helmets being used for civilian construction or being melted down for scrap represented, for some Germans, a tangible demonstration that the Nazi military state had been comprehensively defeated and its apparatus redirected to peaceful purposes. For others, particularly former soldiers, watching equipment they had used in combat being treated as common civilian gear or as scrap metal was painful, representing disrespect for their service, even if they acknowledged the regime's criminality. These divergent reactions reflected broader tensions in how post-war German society would remember the war and how it would distinguish between the Nazi state, on the military that served it, and the individual soldiers who fought. The economic value of helmet steel, while not enormous, was significant enough in resource-starved post-war Germany that purely wasteful destruction made little practical sense. Steel of any kind was valuable for reconstruction, and military helmets represented processed metal that could be repurposed more easily than raw ore could be mined and refined. This economic logic supported policies that allowed melting down and reprocessing rather than simply burying or dumping helmets. Industrial facilities that had produced armaments during the war were converted to civilian production, and some of the steel that had formed helmets ended up in peacetime products ranging from construction materials to household goods, or completing a transformation from military to civilian use that occupation authorities saw as both practically beneficial and symbolically appropriate. The question of whether any stockpiles of Nazi helmets were deliberately preserved, either by German civilians who hid them or by occupation authorities who retained them for various purposes, remained somewhat murky. Certainly, some helmets survived through individual retention. Soldiers who had kept their service helmets as personal property, collectors who saw historical value in preserving military artifacts, individuals who simply found practical use for steel helmets and weren't concerned about their origin. These individually retained helmets, while technically violations of occupation policies that prohibited retaining military equipment, SA were difficult to track and generally weren't priorities for Allied enforcement as long as they weren't being accumulated in quantities that suggested paramilitary organization. The scattered survival of individual helmets meant that when museums and collectors later sought Wehrmacht artifacts, examples were available despite official destruction policies. The longer-term fate of Nazi helmets intersected with the development of the Federal Republic of Germany's own military forces in the 1950s, when the Bundeswehr was established as part of West Germany's integration into NATO. The new German military needed helmets, and questions arose about whether to use existing stockpiles of Wehrmacht equipment or to design new equipment that would symbolically distinguish the democratic Bundeswehr from Nazi-era forces. The decision was ultimately made to develop new helmet designs that, while functionally similar to earlier models, had distinct visual characteristics that prevented them from being confused with Wehrmacht equipment. This choice reflected political judgment that clear visual breaks with the Nazi military were important for both domestic German politics and international acceptance of German rearmament, even when practical considerations might have favored using existing stockpiles. The story of what happened to Nazi helmets after 1945 thus reflected broader patterns in how post-war Germany and the Allied occupiers handled the physical legacy of the Nazi state, attempting to destroy or repurpose equipment that carried ideological associations, struggling to balance practical needs against symbolic concerns. In navigating between total elimination of Nazi remnants and pragmatic recognition that destroyed Germany needed every available resource for reconstruction. The helmets themselves, transformed from symbols of Nazi military might to scrap metal or civilian safety equipment, embodied the comprehensive defeat and repurposing that occupation authorities sought to impose on all aspects of the Nazi state's apparatus.